So I started to think about this, and I thought one of the other things that happens a lot when people are talking at cross purposes about what the purpose of post-publication evaluation is and whether they think one particular effort is succeeding or failing, is this what I started to think of as a kind of like a yin and yang thing. On the one side, you've got people who are really concentrating on the issues like science becoming self-correctable, and correcting, self-correctable and self-correcting. In the literature, you've got people who think, look, the measure of success is by how critical the comments are. If there's not a real lot of just hammering people, then this thing has failed. If it's not getting, the measure is how many retractions do you get, for example, in that kind of a way of looking at it. Who can kind of discredit somebody's research more than somebody else? I'm sort of doing this in kind of like extremes at this point. But what I often think of as the drive-by shooting model of looking at medical research or any kind of scientific research. And then on the other side, you've got this other issue that happens after this publication, and that is that a publication doesn't end when the thing is published, but research doesn't end when the grant is over or the article is published. It's a kind of like it's a milestone that's been given too much kind of emphasis in many ways. And one of the really important things that should be happening after people have shared the results of some kind of scientific research is that other people can build on it and update their work and go back and say, well, okay, well now actually we've changed direction, or that multiple groups who are working in the same areas can kind of share opinions about that, not just the people that they're ordinarily going to come across in the sort of like normal day-to-day interactions, and certainly as people can travel less and less to conferences and so on, and I suppose that's a thing that Australians think about a lot, that process of how much you can fly around the globe and what you miss out on and that kind of stuff. Those abilities for people to actually start to form unusual or serendipitous collaborations and so on becomes a really, really important thing post-publication. Connecting up different conversations that are happening, different pieces of research with each other is an incredibly important part of it. Working through that process of can you actually apply this to the next research step, apply this to policy that we've already heard a bit about, or what does this actually mean for daily practice or whatever. Those kinds of things happen in sort of conversations after an important article has been published. And then that whole issue of how can you actually kind of like expand the field and the kinds of questions that people are going to ask. Having put that up as a kind of like that sort of harmonious thing gives you actually a really false impression. In actual fact, now I particularly chose this not because John is going to follow me, but because this actually is one of my favourite analogies for this, the golden apple of discord. This was sort of given for people who are not familiar with that. It was this kind of thing that said this is for the fairest of them all, and it kind of started this vanity-fueled rage that turned into the Trojan War. And I think that's one of the things that's a really fundamental issue behind this entire thing about post-publication evaluation and discussing what happens after that. Because there is so much at stake for so many people, and because as well we have that whole issue about replication and people's concerns about that. There's an awful lot at stake here for people, and an awful lot of heated feelings. And in fact, I would argue that this social issue is actually the biggest challenge that we've got around post-publication evaluation. Now, this clearly comes from an Australian or British context, this barrister speaking, and I take that in particular because I used to work many years ago in courtrooms in Australia, and one of the things that strikes me a lot working in this area of post-publication is that we actually don't entirely have a proper kind of agreed culture now in the 21st century for how we discuss these things. There is a real clash of culture around that. I mean, in a courtroom, it's really clear. I mean, we all know when you preface something with all due respect, there's absolutely something absolutely excoriating is coming after that. But there's this kind of a process that is a real culture clash. I think it's a clash between cultures, between the people who want to have more open science, and I truly do think there's a generational one as well. Now, one of the things that's a really heated discussion in this entire area about commenting and evaluation after publication is this whole issue of anonymity and so on, and people's concerns. How can you have people be really, really quite open and about what they think about other people's work, given what the repercussions of doing that might be? That's of course not unique to post-publication. It's true of peer review. It's true of every single aspect of every single discussion anyone might ever have, except for those ones that are happening in a bar with your friends or whatever. There's always that whole issue. And I think that issue about how we deal and how we sort of can get to a point where people can actually become, agree more, sort of have more of an agreement on what the culture of this is going to be, and more tolerance for being criticised and the repercussions of that. I mean, I'm not being really utopian about it. I know that this is never going to be an easy thing. This is always going to be a tough thing. But I think we've got a really quite major thing going on here about this. For a lot of people will argue then that the issue of anonymity and pseudonymity is what would protect younger people who want to say something. And I've got a lot of mixed feelings about that, and I can't find any real evidence that would kind of tell me one way or another what that would mean. Because on the one hand, you've got those concerns about what it does to the way people talk, that take away that kind of anonymity, then sort of take away that sort of like revealing who the person is, that it can go fully YouTube, versus, so there's this, what do you gain, what do you lose when you know who's speaking and when you're free of repercussions? And I'm not really sure what the balance of that is going to be, how that would play out. I think that sort of that fear that it would become extremely, extremely unpleasant and people would just ignore it is a real risk. And at the same time, we're clearly losing important content. Somehow we have to find a way around it, but I'm not really sure what the answer is. I think on the issue of generation, we've got it's a mixed thing, because while on the one hand you've got people who are and it's quite clearly quite good strong basis for being concerned when you're in any kind of subordinate position and you criticise people who are above you, that there are going to be repercussions. But on the other hand, a younger generation has actually got some real advantages here. People in the sort of the new internet age, they're much more used to everything from the formatting links to the, to moving fast and saying something quickly, and they've actually got some really serious advantages once the whole process of conversation goes online and happens fast. So I think it's a mixed bag. One thing I don't think is a mixed bag, though, and this is the issue of gender. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about this. We talk a fair bit about a leaky pipeline in science careers. One of the things as I was sort of doing research for this talk, I came to the conclusion that there's a leaky pipeline in the life cycle of publication as well. And it's extremely profound. I actually was quite... I spent a bit of time really thinking about this and realising it's worse than a lot of the other leaky pipelines as near as I can see. It's not surprising when you look at a lot of the other research about gender issues in terms of blindness and deafness, to whether people are there, whether they're speaking up, and whether you involve them in discussions and so on. there's quite a fair bit of research now that shows that at this point in time, because of socialisation and a whole range of issues, that women do tend to speak less in work situations and professional situations when there's mixed genders there. And a lot of us have seen this, I think, looking at the kind of the spread of kind of age and genders in this room, I'm hoping there's going to be, when it gets to question time, that it isn't only going to be guys getting up asking questions. But we all know that we can sit at a conference or a meeting or anything else for hours and not hear a female voice, even when there's a majority of females in the room. And we know for a lot of reasons why this is so. When I was sort of looking up some things, I was going to do a cartoon about this and then thought better of it, because it's kind of like a risky area. Even a cartoonist can get a bit scared about making a gender cartoon. But there's this kind of, as well as that kind of notion of selective blindness and selective deafness, there's this DSM category of thing which I'd never come across before, called selective mutism, which actually is a kind of like a social phobia and an anxiety. And as I was kind of like reading the symptoms of this, which was this, being in a particular kind of social setting, being afraid to say something, and the heart racing, and all of this kind of thing, and the sheer terror welling up, I thought, gee, how often, do I feel like that? And how familiar is that a feeling to all of us? I'm not saying it's pathological, but I'm saying it's certainly one of those things that is kind of keeping back, I think, a lot of women from public speaking, from all of those kinds of things. You watch it reflected through everything, whether it's Twitter, whether it's blogging, whether it's who publishes the most, and so on. But the leaky pipeline bit that I want to talk about is this whole business about peer review and then post-publication commenting. When I looked at the literature on gender and peer review, for everything that I could find, the concern totally was with, is there an effect of gender bias on the peer review process, on the careers of editors and editorial staff, and on the manuscripts that get published? Given that there's a massive gender and underrepresentation of women in those processes, what was really striking to me looking at it was that nobody that I could find was talking about what is the effect on women of this, on them themselves. And I thought perhaps that's part of why we see so few comments by females, either in the discussion about post-publication peer review, on Twitter or anywhere else in the literature, and then in the comments themselves. It's really quite dramatic. And so, I thought perhaps there is actually harm to the careers of women themselves, that they don't perhaps get the practice in this area. So I think that that's actually something that we actually really have to start to take more seriously, because the consequences are saying, okay, you've got one entire gender keeping their thoughts to themselves or sharing it only amongst each other is actually incredibly serious. And any of these kind of, we need plumbing all the way along all of these pipelines anyway. And one of the things that strikes me is what I started to sort of talk to myself, calling it science, opinion, craft skills, the real trade stuff. Being able to write fast, write often, and the leaving aside the public speaking things, which are kind of an issue as well. But in terms of this thing about kind of written evaluation for that stays on the record, issues around doing citation properly. I mean, you'd expect somebody from who works at the National Library of Medicine to get frustrated about this, but we've all spent heaps of time trying to find this thing that was cited and not be able to. And one of the things that really is in the way of us having a really well-connected kind of conversation around research is the fact that people cite so poorly, make so many mistakes in their citations and don't sort of understand the importance of it. We also see this real deficit in this thing of the linking and the formatting. For Pubmed Commons, and I'll come back to that when I talk about Pubmed Commons, this point will come up, I mean, the thing is constructed that if somebody comments on an article, any article, that it could all be interlinked. But that depends on people actually doing the formatting. It isn't rocket science, but there's clearly a long way that we've got to go with getting people to start to actually do those things. And these things are just skills things and educational issues. And the issue of curation. Because before we can ever get to the point of having a really, really kind of like technical approach to starting to really interlink things, and even then, we're going to rely a lot on curation. And we can expect that there's a certain level of self-interest there that's going to drive a fair amount of that. If I've just done a whole lot of work trying to replicate somebody else's research and I've just published my study, I've got some incentive and some interest and motivation, you would think, to go and start creating a link between my study and their study. So there is a kind of a process that you can say, well, there is actually already some interest, self-interest there in doing this. But it does become a thing that we actually have to get people to understand or to start to incorporate that as this is part of the work of what I do, that I actually have a curation role in some senses after this. I don't just do my own CV or whatever, but I've got to start actually doing these things. I've put here that there's an expanding role for librarians here because, as a lot of people would know, I mean, a very large proportion of academics don't do any of this stuff themselves, you know, which of course is one of the really big barriers that we've got to that issue about sharing and so on, and keeping CVs properly and citations properly and so on. But we really need, I think, librarians to actually start to sort of embrace this. And it's certainly in terms of Pubmed Commons, they've got to start actually publishing things, even if they're letters, in Medline Index journals so that they can get into the literature and really participate. But that actually, again, implies a kind of a way of rethinking what that role actually is and what they should be doing, or what they could be doing. I shouldn't be telling people what they should do, but that would be my hope. Okay, so Pubmed Commons. For people who don't know, but I'll remind you again that I'm not speaking formally on behalf of Pubmed Commons, this is my personal opinion. It's a forum for scientific discourse within PubMed. It went public so that people could see the comments and relatively easily join Pubmed Commons if they're an eligible author in December 2013. At the end of September, and so what we really had was, we had a kind of a lot of growth and then it kind of plateaued out. Where we're at the moment is there's over 6,500 members and nearly 2,000 active comments. And next one. To explain what the kind of like the basic cornerstones of Pubmed Commons were, resolving those issues about those concerns that people have got about not becoming YouTube and those kinds of things, which are a really strong thing, and not having involving researchers and scientists and authors in a constant kind of battle, you know, with unfair comments or whatever. One of the decisions that was regarded as important was that to comment in PubMed, you had to be the author of a publication in PubMed. So that was one of the sort of the going in issues. Another one was to have no anonymous accounts and allow no pseudonyms. That there could be rating of comments but not of publications. That there would be post-comment moderation only, so that if you're a Pubmed Commons member and you press that post button, it is in PubMed. You can delete it, but it goes live. But we are moderating afterwards. There's a Creative Commons license. And that we would go into it in a stage-evaluated way so that we could see what, you know, how sustainable this was going to be. So a personal wish list about commenting in general, but for me in particular about the issue about PubMed and other places like that are kind of wherever you've got what is in effect for the literature a water cooler. that people gather, a large number of people gather around. I mean, millions of people are going to PubMed every day, and it's kind of a real kind of front-end place for people to get research. So some of this is particularly related to that. I'm not as concerned as a lot of other people are about the issue about that conversation is happening all over the place and it's disconnected. That's always going to be the case. It's certainly happening with Pubmed Commons. I mean, most things in Pubmed Commons have got kind of like one, maybe two comments, maybe a comment and then maybe a reply from the author, that kind of thing. There's an awful lot of conversation about Pubmed Commons comments, though, happening outside Pubmed Commons. And that's a kind of... I actually think that's actually quite a good thing. I mean, you can't change it even if you wanted to anyway. It's actually quite a good thing because to some extent that process of really, really long strings of comments, my personal opinion is that people kind of shut those out more and more. And then you get that kind of a process of how do you kind of, if it's sort of said 50 comments below, I'm not that sure how many people read all of those, but that's just a kind of a personal opinion at this stage, and we'll kind of understand more about that in time. But I would like there to be more commenting. I mean, that would be the main criticism that I'd have at the moment about Pubmed Commons is the quantity. A lot of what's in there is actually really quite powerful. We've had people even putting in entire data sets of entire clinical trials and all sorts of things in response to questions. So it's hard to argue that there isn't an important scientific contribution going on. If anybody who actually really looked at that record for a lot of these things, it would kind of really change an awful lot of things about how they saw that research that was reported there. I'd really like to see a real lot more rating. And that seems to me, that was a surprise to me, I would have thought that people would rate more than they would comment. I mean, it's anonymous, nobody knows you've done it, it's pretty easy, and yet it isn't really happening. And I guess that's a cultural thing. But if this kind of process is ever going to upscale, you're actually terribly reliant on some kind of reputation and trust system. Of people starting to understand, I mean, if you can't sort of sit there and keep putting in huge numbers of people trying to sift things and decide what to highlight and all that kind of stuff. You really need some kind of signal from the community, and one that can't be gamed, that you have to work to make sure it's not being gamed. But you really actually need that, I think, for a lot of these systems to kind of have the full potential that they could have. Fortunately, there's an awful lot of work in this area because this is true of everything from Google to like you name it. I mean, it's an incredibly well-developed field because so many people are sort of concerned about it. But at its core, you really do need a kind of like a rating culture as well as a commenting culture, and so that's something that I think is terribly important. I alluded again before to the issue of capturing the intellectual effort of journal clubs. And that's something that certainly is going to be a major focus for Pubmed Commons in the coming weeks and months, to try to make a concerted effort to do that and enable that and create the ability for journal clubs to have journal club accounts and start to post things. And I think that that's actually potentially incredibly important. And it's an interesting process because you know that when a certain paper comes out, almost everybody's journal club is discussing that paper, and it's sad that just goes under the waterline. The issue of more credit for post-publication effort, and I've phrased it that way because I think that there's, we have had comments on Pubmed Commons, as people have them everywhere, that are things like, we literally have one that's something like, this is my favourite paper from my Uncle Harry, something like that, and that's that kind of like, I sort of think of that as the kind of Facebook type commenting. I mean, there's no way somebody should kind of get massive academic credit for having said, my boss's paper is wonderful, there's that kind of a process, or that necessarily every single time somebody says, they failed to cite me kind of thing is not necessarily something that's kind of like an incredible effort. But I'm not saying that it's always unimportant. It can be terribly important, and it's critical that people are able to do it. But I'd really like to see, and this is kind of not unique to the issue of post-publication evaluation, and that moving away from too much emphasis on credit just for publications, those things like data sharing and going back and updating the record and saying, okay, this new project has this implications for this previous project, because people are still reading that old project, they're still citing it, they're still writing grant applications. They may not have been able to do an adequate search that they found the recent things that are relevant to the paper that they're looking at. Going back and actually trying to expand on the record and make it a living record of research is something that I really do think needs to be given more credit for. And it's a cultural change that really should happen. And unfortunately, we know that just because it's a great idea doesn't mean that people are actually going to do it. So there's got to be some kind of incentive. And that's a very important, lively discussion that's going on. A culture of author response. I mean, we've seen that, we saw that the same thing happened with letters to the editor. You look at study after study of that, and not that every single comment requires a response. If somebody's just said how terrific your paper is, you don't necessarily have to get in and say, thanks, mate. I like your papers too. I mean, I don't mean that that we want to say every single comment must be replied to. It's not that. But there are things that actually, there is going to be a kind of like a cycle there of that commenting will be encouraged if there actually gets to be a response. I mean, it's worth asking a question if somebody answers it. I mean, we have that whole issue when people are doing systematic reviews of trials, for example. You're chasing authors down all the time for data and whatever that were explanations for things that weren't in the papers. This actually leads into the next question. I actually think, and I could be entirely wrong about this, but it seems to me that it's getting harder, that all these people who don't want to get emails are no longer putting their emails in their papers, and in fact entire journals don't put author emails in. This process of actually trying to track people down and get responses and find them isn't made easier by people making it hard to get in touch with them. But sometimes people are saying, well, why hasn't this author responded? And you can't even be sure this author even really knows this comment exists. And how could you? The corresponding author is, was somebody who's long since gone, and that nobody else on there has left any trace. And when you try and find them on their university website, they don't have their emails there either. It can actually be incredibly difficult to track people down. So there's a whole lot of things that go into that area of how do we actually get real engagement with authors, and how can that be expected? There's a culture that we get back to that culture issue. Almost everything gets us back to that culture issue. I think we get all of these kind of comments of people saying, and people would have seen these in debates all over the place, in blogs and Twitter, and certainly it's happening on Pubmed Commons. My paper's peer-reviewed. Your comment, however, is not peer-reviewed, which kind of like each time that happens, and I totally understand the feeling behind it, because every single comment, every single question doesn't necessarily have merit. I mean, you can kind of like throw mud at people and it sticks, whether there is any reason for it at all. So it's perfectly understandable that there's kind of, a reaction about a kind of like a free-for-all approach to people criticising. On the other hand, it's a strange idea of what peer review is and what peer review means. As anybody who's kind of like looked at the kind of trials and the systematic reviews of trying to look at what impact peer review has and how much of a guarantee of quality or correctness or whatever it isn't that. And truly you'd get in an absolute recursive loop. I mean, when would it end? You peer review a comment and then you peer review and we've all had that process of kind of seeing comments from peer reviewers that were absolutely, what? This person doesn't know what they're doing. And there's evidence too, for example, with clinical trials that sometimes the quality of the research or whatever is actually lowered by peer review. So, you've got that kind of a process that it's fully understandable, but again, we actually kind of have to change that kind of idea of what peer review means, and having an argument that's totally on the merits, not the "who do you think you are" kind of thing, which I'd have to say is sort of a thing that I'm sort of very familiar with, because when I sort of started in this whole area, it wasn't even just that I wasn't a healthcare practitioner or a scientist or an academic. I'm a high school dropout. I don't even have a degree. So you can imagine the extent of "who do you think you are" that I got in the first few years. Quite something, really. I'm glad it was before Twitter. Although I still do get, who's listening to her kind of thing. Fair enough. And then you've got this this whole issue then of how we sort of capitalise on the technical capacity and APIs and a whole lot of issues. Something that I think is going to be particularly important in how we actually start to develop capacity around linking up replications and attempted replications and so on with original studies.